well, you just said that liberalism is the rejection of the Christian form. You also say that liberalism could be defined as the political form of evil, a very strong statement,
Yeah, yeah.
and you have a very specific sense of what that means, and it really has to do with this distinction between act and potency.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe we can introduce that idea that the idea of that liberalism, starting with God, makes God into a God of potency.
Yeah. Well, so I actually stand by that phrase, even though it sounds extreme, but I mean it in a very particular way, and I'll come back to it. Um, I think I refer to this in the book. C.S. Lewis has a beautiful image about the de-Christianizing of the West, which is a kind of disincarnation. This assertion of a kind of neutral secularity pretends to be hearkening back to the pre-Christian era, but in fact, you can't pretend that Christianity didn't happen. And to
Right.
go back to that, you have to actually reject what came between.
Right.
So he said it's sort of like a divorced woman claiming to be a virgin again. I mean, in a sense, that doesn't. That's you can't undo history.
Right.
Similarly, the church has existed, and God has in fact revealed himself in history. And so in order to try to recover a pre-Christian sense of nature, you actually have to reject what's given. So neutrality is can only be apparent. It's actually to attain neutrality, you need to actually neutralize or eliminate the claim of, deny the claim of what is already given. And if that's the case, it means and if liberalism was an attempt to try to rethink political order sort of outside of the Christian tradition, it means that the very forms of liberalism have the character of this rejection of the Christian claim that's sort of baked into the forms of liberalism. T.S. Eliot has some wonderful reflections on how liberalism, this kind of negating of this freedom from, this movement away from this sort of fundamental no or denial that's kind of baked into liberalism. You see that in its tendency to fragment and to dissolve, which I think is something we're all aware of. If you connect that point with this larger argument that the very heart of liberalism is kind of turning away from the church, then you see what it means to say that liberalism is the political form of evil. I mean, just to work out the syllogism there, if evil is a privation of the good, a turning away from the good, and if the good is God, and if God has in fact revealed himself in history, then a turn away from the church, from the actual tradition as it is given in history, is, regardless of one's intentions, one's motivations, one can be doing it for all sorts of very understandable human reasons, desire to be inclusive, a rejection of abuse and corruption and so forth. I mean, there are thousands of very understandable reasons, but whatever the reasons happen to be, objectively speaking, the form is this taking a place outside of the Christian tradition. And so that is a rejection
Right.
of God, and therefore it's evil, as a privation.
So this isn't the God of the philosophers in search of something more concrete, on the way to something more concrete. This is the God of the philosophers taken as refusing to acknowledge, at least on a public level, and we'll get into that issue later,
Sure. Yeah.
The Christian God.
That's right. I mean, the God of the philosophers is I have a lot of love for the God of the philosophers. So but the God of the philosophers, in a way, is God prior to his. I'm going to qualify that in a moment, but prior to his actual revelation in history.
Mm-hmm.
So again, history matters. It's very different to this is Paul's speech at the Areopagus in Acts. The Greeks have an unknown God that they worship, and he reveals to them that unknown God is the God of Jesus Christ. So the God of the philosophers turns out to be the God of Jesus Christ. To try to sort of erase the history, take a few steps back, and bracket out the actual revelation of God in
Right.
Christ. It's no longer the God of the philosophers. Actually, it becomes something very different. And you see that in fact, the sort of academic discussions of the philosophical God are so radically different from the ancient philosophical approach to God, precisely because the ancients weren't setting aside theology, because there was no such thing, whereas the moderns do, and so it changes the philosophy. But
Right. So that's why I mentioned act and potency, although the potential is a word that you use in the book discussing this, because it's God in this abstracted sense as God who could do any number of things, not as God who did do the things that he actually did. So it really, in a sense, even though, yes, God didn't necessarily have to do things exactly as he has done them. These are free acts of God.
Right.
It's because he has actually done them. To speak as though he didn't is to reduce him to potency. Or as you put it, actualizing a potency precisely qua potency, in the book.
Yeah, and that sounds like that's a very sort of high level metaphysical set of terms there, which may appear abstract, but the point, but I think they're actually very important and very helpful in thinking through a lot of these questions in political philosophy, as a matter of fact. But it's that problem can be traced back to the nominalism in the late medieval period, where they made a distinction between God's potentia absoluta, his absolute power, and his potentia ordinata, which is his ordained powers, the way it gets translated. But the idea is God as he actually is. So given God's actual decisions, if you will, that's a bit anthropomorphic, but for the sake of argument, given how God has actually turned out to be and the actual decisions he's made and so forth, versus what God could have done, potentially. In the early Middle Ages, the thought about what God could have done, could any of the persons of the Trinity been incarnate instead of the Son? Could God have become incarnate in an ass as opposed to a man? Could God, these sorts of questions, they were understood to be abstract questions. But what happens towards the end of the Middle Ages is that they become reified, and so one begins to think that the way God happened to reveal himself is just one face that he was showing to the world, but the truth of God is this absolutely infinitely unpredictable power.
Right.
And once you do that, I mean, Christianity becomes just one possible religion among many.
Right.
You don't know whether the natural law loses its foundation. One could go on and on, but you see the point.
Yeah, and it's tricky because you have to retain the freedom of God and not have it so that his providential dispositions are just sort of necessary emanations from who and what he is, but at the same time recognize that the way he has revealed himself is in fact the best, the perfect, the perfect way for him to reveal himself.
No, thank you for making that point. That's a crucial point. So absolutely,
it's not arbitrary.
It's not arbitrary. Yeah, no, but this is here's to me the decisive thing. This question of whether God had to become incarnate or he didn't have to. When we ask that question, we tend to step outside of what God actually did.
Right.
And think of God as being faced with these two choices. And then we're forced into a dilemma. Was God compelled by some logic to become incarnate? Or was he not compelled, and so it was something that was kind of an arbitrary act? But both of those sort of start with the abstract God of possibility. So in other words, that's as opposed to beginning with the actual God revealed in history, you see. It's the question really depends on your starting point for reflection, what you take to be the absolute to which everything else is relative. So one can affirm begin with the actuality of God's revelation in Christ and therefore in the church, in Mary and in the church, and then see that through the nature of this revelation, we see that God is infinitely free, and in a kind of an abstract sense, God could have acted in infinitely different ways, but we can trust that they would all, in a way, share features analogously with what he in fact has done, because this is in a way this is the truth of God made manifest.